The New Testament records that Jesus gave sight to the blind and made the lame walk. But this week, the world's media was celebrating the success of science to give a man the power to walk again. Pioneering therapy developed in the United Kingdom enabled the patient who was paralysed from the chest down in a knife attack in 2010 to walk using a frame after an operation involving cells from his nasal cavity being transplanted into his spinal cord. Some newspapers hailed it a scientific miracle. But the term miracle, of course, clearly has religious meanings. So is science now taking over the space once occupied by faith? If you were in need of healing, would you turn to a doctor or to prayer? Or are those questions laced with false dichotomies? I've been speaking to Professor David Wilkinson, a theologian at Durham University, who in a previous career was an astrophysicist, the writer Mick Nugent, who's head of Atheist Ireland, and speaking first, Dr Michael Moran, a lecturer in medicine at Queen's University, who also acts as a medical investigator in suspected cases of miracles at Lourdes.
A discovery like this is a summation of years of work to get to this stage to make this fantastic breakthrough scientifically, and I fully appreciate that as in its own entity. But most people with religious belief are intelligent enough and sort of, developed enough to appreciate that there are two sides to it, and I can both appreciate the scientific aspect of things whilst also appreciating that there are some things we can't explain. And in my mind, that's what I'm happy to attribute to faith and religion, whereas I understand that other people wouldn't share that belief, which is totally fine by me.
But isn't that a version of the God of the Gaps approach to religion? When you can't find a scientific explanation, well, let's use a divine explanation.
Well, the two sit well together in the sense that as the science and the ability, I believe, of humanity is a gift from God. But that's not to say that humanity can't steer its own fate given what they have at their disposal. As we see, we can make autonomous decisions and things, but I still think there's so much that we can't explain. And from personal experience, be it in Lourdes or be it just at home with people I've come in contact with through work and not through work, you see things all the time that we can't explain that I'm happy to attribute to divinity, whereas I know other people would just say it's something like coincidence or fate.
Mick Nugent, what's your response to that approach to scientific explanation?
Well, if you take Lourdes as an example, there's over 200 million people have visited Lourdes over the last 150 years, and there's less than 100 approved miracles by the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. That's so you're talking about maybe 1 in every 3 million. And the medical board was introduced to test miracles from Lourdes. They went down from about 50 a year to about 1 a year, and over the last few decades it's gone down to about 1 a decade. In 2008, Pope Benedict gave Catholics a special time-limited free plenary indulgence that would get them early release from purgatory if they go to Lourdes, and that was at around the time that the Vatican had launched Vatican Airlines, which was bringing people on pilgrimages to Lourdes. Everybody has the right to believe whatever they want to believe, but these beliefs are causing people to, I think, unfairly exploit vulnerable people by creating the impression that if they go to a particular place that the creator of the universe will help them to get better, where there's no evidence that that's the case.
So could I just go back to that? So I would, I take on board what you're saying in terms of, the number of people that have footfall in Lourdes, and then the number of miracles, which is now 69, and 2 of whom I met this weekend passed there in Lourdes. Lourdes never set out to be a miracle factory, or, it was never billed as such by the church. It was observation of things that were happening at the time. And I think, I fully appreciate where you're coming from, Mick, but at the same time, some of the people who've become the best advocates for Lourdes are those who didn't believe and who went.
Do you agree with the plenary indulgences being offered for vulnerable people to go to Lourdes?
Well, I'm personally not here to speak on behalf of the Catholic Church, and I'm really actually here as a medical doctor, but I also have faith and understand that's why I'm sort of suitable for this discussion.
Do you believe that it's a good thing from a medical perspective to tell vulnerable people that they'll get a free plenary indulgence that will get them out of purgatory if they go to Lourdes?
The people that we would bring to Lourdes are people who are seeking to go to Lourdes and who could only go to Lourdes with doctors and nurses like myself and thousands of people across the world who will facilitate trips. Never would we actually force someone to go or encourage someone to go who didn't want to go. It's always that we're facilitating, we're going with their wishes. But to go back to the original point,
do you think that it's a good idea to offer them free plenary indulgences that will get them out of a supernatural realm into another supernatural realm?
From a personal point of view, I am not aware of anyone who went solely for that reason. But let me just use one example of a medic, so someone who's medically trained, who is a Nobel Prize winner in France called Alexis Carrel, who died 70 years ago around about this week, and he went to Lourdes under duress at first from Lyon, having been brought up a Catholic but then become agnostic, had no belief in God, went to Lourdes, witnessed a cure, and then rediscovered his Catholicism, and as a result of that then was kind of outcast from French medicine, from the circles, because it was believed that he was so out of touch with what was happening scientifically in the early 1900s that he actually ended up living in the States and then went on to win the Nobel Prize. But someone like him, or Émile Zola equally, who witnessed miracles at Lourdes, having come from a very sceptical point of view, have really just documented facts. I don't mind if you don't believe it or not. What we have done with International Medical Committee of Lourdes is laid down facts, and the reason that there are so few miracles is because the process is so thorough, because we don't want to trick anyone, we don't want to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We're simply documenting medical fact.
David Wilkinson, let me bring you in on this comment, if you like, on the notion of miracle. It's quite a complex notion, but the way this conversation is going, you might have predicted this. Some people will say, well, you've got to make a choice. You've got to make a choice in life about where you put your trust and where you look for help. Religion versus science.
No, I think it's a little more complicated than that. And so whenever it comes to a miracle, and I do believe that God sometimes does unusual things within the universe, that he gives himself freedom to do that, the physicist within me, as well as the theologian, incidentally, wants to ask the question of evidence. And so I don't agree with Mick in his comments earlier that there is no evidence to religious belief. I think there's evidence which we can talk about and interpret and actually disagree on. But it's about sifting the evidence and then building a model that best interprets the evidence in front of us.
Yes, but prayer doesn't keep a jetliner in the air. It's science and technology, David, that does that.
Sure. And actually, the reason I sit in a jetliner is I've got enough evidence for science and technology to convince me to do that, even though I might not understand how it actually works. Now, when it comes to, say, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I may not understand fully how it works, and it's not reproducible in the same way that experiments on the wing of aircraft are. But there is a certain amount of evidence that I can look to, I can sift, I can look at. I mean, for me, who knows nothing about Lourdes, actually 60 miracles isn't too bad at all. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But I'd want to sit down and look at the evidence.
It's not the case that you're putting your faith in science, though.
I think we have faith in science. It works, as a philosopher Michael Polanyi once talked about, as tacit skills. That is, there are elements
you can call it faith,
judgment.
but you might just call it explanatory confidence, in that there's a track record of success in explanation.
Absolutely, William, you're absolutely right on that. But also one could say that could be paralleled within religious belief, not all religious belief, but explanatory confidence that takes an integrating approach to a whole number of different phenomena in the world and gets the best explanation of it.
I suspect, Mick, it annoys you intensely when people talk about placing faith in science.
Well, it doesn't annoy me, but it's just mistaken. Faith is believing things because you want to believe them disproportionately to the currently best available evidence. Science doesn't do that. Science is proportionate to the currently best available evidence, and science adjusts when new evidence emerges. And the difference between religion and science in the context of reconciling them is you can believe in things where they're complementary, but when they clash, then you have to choose between the two. And when religion tells us that Jesus rose from the dead and science tells us that people don't rise from the dead, then you have to choose between the two. When religion tells us that Muhammad flew on a winged horse and science tells us there are no winged horse, you have to choose between them. When religion tells us that people are possessed by demons, as the current Pope does in endorsing an organisation of exorcists recently, and science tells us that it's a mental illness, then you have to choose between science and religion.
David, is it the case that religion, that theology, for example, doesn't engage in revising its interpretation of the world on the basis of facts?
Of course it does. There are certain fundamental tenets to any religious belief system, but it does develop and it does revise. And I disagree with Mick in terms of his definition of faith. Faith is trust on the basis of evidence, and that happens both within science and within religion. Of course, they're different art forms, they're different ways of looking at the world and assessing evidence. They have their nuances between them. But theology develops. It takes into account new experiences and new discoveries. It looks back, of course, as Mick rightly said, to a body of revelation. In the Christian case, the life, death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as the central, supreme piece of evidence. And that is revelation, a belief that it is given, but it's given into the historical space-time of the universe.
And you get that revelation, as you put it, from a sacred text.
Well, in a sense of Christian faith, yes, indeed. But it's not just the sacred text. It's the way that the text resonates or doesn't with experience. The Jesus who I experience historically is also the Jesus that I experience in everyday life.
Have you ever seen anyone being healed of paralysis through faith?
No, I haven't.
Why do you believe then that happened historically in the Bible, that Jesus caused miracles of that kind to happen?
I think the evidence is pretty good in terms of the gospel reports of it. I don't think they were simply made up to say something profound about Jesus. I think the texture of the gospel accounts, the fact that they don't quite fit together as if they'd been constructed in some neat way, gives me a sense that these stories have a ring of truth about them.
Yes, but you understand the reason I asked that question, David, because you said you believe not just because it's in the text, because it resonates also with your experience. Here you have no experience of people picking up their beds and walking through a healing experience, but you still believe the text.
I might not have personal experience of that, William, but the worldwide Christian community would testify to experience of that. And there are lots of things in this world that I may not have personal experience of, but I have to take on board what others report. And that's true of science. I'm not an expert in anything beyond a little bit of astrophysics that I understand here and there. But in terms of the scientific picture of the world, I have to trust in those who report their experiments, their evidence, and their interpretation of that evidence.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you believe that Muhammad flew on a winged horse? And do you believe that the dead rose and appeared to many when Jesus died? And what are your reasons for believing one and not the other, if that is the case?
Mick, I don't understand enough about Islam in terms of its claim about Muhammad and a winged horse. And the Bible accounts, the gospel accounts of the tombs being opened when Jesus rose from the dead are very sketchy indeed. And I keep a complete open mind about that because I don't think there's enough evidence on it.
They're testified in Matthew 27. He says that it happened.
Oh, yes. But I mean, in terms of the way that the early church then interpret that or reinterpret that or represent that is quite sketchy.
So you're not sure if there was a physical resurrection?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure that there was a physical resurrection of Jesus. I think the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as a physical resurrection, a bodily resurrection, is very clear indeed. It's a cumulative case of a whole number of different arguments. What I'm unsure about is one or two of the other very fleeting descriptions of certain miracles, which one wants to sit down and just keep an open mind about.
I'm interested in that though, David, because you have strong confidence in the physical resurrection on the basis of these texts, and yet you've less confidence about other things that are recorded in the text. How that looks a bit like a pick and mix approach to the text.
No, I don't think it is. It's simply saying, let's take the weight of evidence that the text itself is presenting. Now, in terms of the physical resurrection, it is a central tenet of the New Testament.
So if the text says it over and over again, you have more confidence than if it says it just once?
If it says it from a number of different views, if there are a number of different reports, if there are a number of different arguments, yes, I do have
Michael Moran, what do you make of that
that
approach to the text?
I agree with what he's saying in the sense that the four Gospels, you have four versions of the same thing, and therefore
that gives you
there's
more
evidence for
terms.
it. The other thing is,
Mick Nugent will just say you've just got a repetition of the same point. That doesn't make it evidence.
The fact of the matter is we're still talking about it.
Contradictory repetitions.
But we're still talking about it 2014 years on, so from a point of view of Christianity, it sort of signifies that there was something there that's stood the test of time.
Islam's still talking about
I'm not
reported about Muhammad. That doesn't necessarily mean they're true.
No, but we all appreciate each other's beliefs, and I'm speaking from the point of view of my own, and I think we have to sort of deal with what we know and understand that we can't definitely prove or disprove what happened then, so we use the best evidence that we have.
Have you ever seen with your eyes someone healed of paralysis?
I haven't seen the healing because it was 50 odd years ago and I'm not old enough, but I've met someone who has.
What kind of healings have you seen?
The two that I saw at the weekend were, one was a nun with a neuromuscular disability from the 60s when she was healed. She's regained full function, and the other lady had an endocrine tumour, which is sort of harder to see and visualise. But there's a guy who comes to Ireland fairly regularly, having been cured in Lourdes over 50 years ago, who had osteosarcoma of the pelvis and who can now walk normally and volunteers every year. He himself was barely conscious when he was brought there, so it wasn't an act of faith really on his part because it was passive. his mother from Italy wanted him to go, so he was brought, and he, in the baths, suddenly realised that his appetite came back, and that was a sign then for him. And in terms of
medical science has no alternative explanation for how that could happen.
No alternative explanation, but the important thing is that
except
it's
that stuff
verifiable.
Happens that we can't explain.
Yeah, but I mean that happens anyway. I mean, it doesn't only happen in Lourdes, but what I have seen with my eyes is the guy walking, but I've also seen his verified x-rays from before and after, where there was total destruction of bone, and then after his cure you can see the regeneration of both the head of femur and also the acetabulum, the socket of the hip bone. Now you could just say that that's just a coincidence that he happened to be there at the time, but from a personal point of view, it did happen in Lourdes, and that's not to be disputed, and it also is a verifiable medical change that we have no explanation for.
Something happened. No one will argue that with that. Something happened.
But surely
your interpretation is it was a miracle. Clearly, Mick, it's not your interpretation.
Yeah, surely the response there is we don't know. We don't know why it happened. Why on earth would you believe that the creator of a universe of 100 billion galaxies, each of which is 100 billion stars like our sun, would focus on one place in France and say, I'm going to heal people there and nowhere else? I mean, what we say is we don't know.
But Mick, I'm coming at it from the point of view as well of a doctor. You know, the reason I'm on the committee is not because I believe in miracles. I'm on it. We medically verify the evidence, and then it goes to the church. So I mean, it's a very, very thorough process that takes many, many years. So I'm very happy to be associated with the committee in the sense that it's medically verifiable, because my professional reputation obviously goes alongside that. But what's different about the cases we look at in Lourdes, and I know the issue is much bigger than this, but what happens in Lourdes is that it's an instantaneous thing that happened in Lourdes. You know, it's not something that's taken place over the course of weeks and months.
Mick Nugent.
Well, look, you've got this God that has, over the generations, gone from creating the universe and flooding the entire planet through to more sort of minor miracles like raising people from the dead and curing people in various places like that, to moving statues and appearing on pieces of toast. And as time goes on, the achievements, miracle-wise, of this God become seemingly more and more trivial compared to what it used to be able to do when science wasn't able to explain what was happening.
And that, to you, Mick, looks like religious explanations are being squeezed out as science becomes more successful.
Yeah, and that's continually happening. And if you look at things like the World Values Survey, which shows around the world that as people move away from survival values and towards self-expression values, people simultaneously move away from religious values and towards secular rational values.
We're nearly out of time, but I want a final word from David Wilkinson on this. As a theologian, David, take up Mick's point here about the God of the universe, who must have a busy time, you must accept, healing some people for reasons we can't explain, but ignoring thousands of people who are dying from Ebola.
Yeah, William, I don't have an easy and simple answer to why God does some miracles and not others. That's one of the unanswered questions that I have. The God that I see in Jesus, however, is a God who's active, who does unusual things and free things in the universe. And I want to hold that together with a sense that God is the miracle worker in the sense that he's sustaining every moment of the universe's history and the whole of the scientific network. Ernest Walton, who was of course an Irish Nobel Prize winner in physics, worked with Rutherford on the splitting of the atom, talked about how when we come to something that we don't understand, we simply don't give up the quest for understanding. We go on, both scientifically and theologically, asking questions about it.
And he was also a Methodist preacher like yourself.
He was also a Methodist lay preacher and a man of deep spirituality and deeply committed to science. And that doesn't mean that we have the answer to every question. It just means that we have the passion to keep on asking the questions.
Professor David Wilkinson, Mick Nugent and Dr Michael Moran.